On March 14, 1855, in Fairfax County, Virginia, Colonel Richard Thornhill died in his study, 3 hours after signing manumission papers for his cook, a woman named Celia, whom he had owned for 17 years. The household physician, Dr. Samuel Garrett, recorded the cause as heart failure, though Colonel Thornhill no cardiac symptoms and had entertained guests the previous evening in apparent good health. Within 6 months, 3 depositions would be filed with the county clerk alleging deliberate poisoning. The Thornhill estate would enter litigation that would last 9 years, and every record of Celia's subsequent whereabouts would vanish from official documentation. Could an act of sustained violence against one's enslaver constitute legitimate resistance? Or does the granting of freedom in the victim's final hours transform murder into something morally unresolvable? Subscribe to the Bondage Chronicles for stories that refuse simple answers. Now, turn to where it began. Celia stood at the kitchen table with her hands submerged in cold salted water, working the blood from a cotton cloth that had wrapped the previous night's lamb. The fabric released its stain in thin pink clouds. She had been standing there since before dawn, first building the cooking fire, then preparing the morning bread dough, then sorting through the root vegetables that had arrived the day before from the eastern fields. The house above her was still quiet, though she could hear the faint creak of floorboards as Colonel Thornhill's valet moved through the upstairs chambers. The kitchen occupied the basement level of the main house, with 2 narrow windows set high in the brick walls that allowed in pale morning light, but no direct of the yard. She lifted the cloth from the water, wrung it with both hands, and laid it across the drying line strung above the fire. The cook's responsibilities extended beyond food preparation into a complex web of management that required her to track the colonel's dietary preferences, anticipate the needs of unexpected guests, manage limited supplies delivered weekly from Richmond, and maintain absolute discretion about what she observed in the household. She had learned over years of service that the kitchen was a position of conditional trust, located inside the main house rather than in the separate slave quarters, which meant proximity to the family's conversations and routines, but also constant exposure to supervision. Mrs. Thornhill died 4 years earlier, leaving the household without a mistress, which had expanded Celia's authority over domestic operations, while simultaneously removing the buffer that had occasionally existed between her and the colonel's direct oversight. She moved to the larder and began singing ingredients for the noon meal, her hands moving through practiced motions that required no conscious thought. "Colonel wants his breakfast sent up in 20 minutes. Not the usual 30, said Thomas, the valet, appearing at the top of the kitchen stairs. He was a thin man in his 40s, owned by the Thornhill family since childhood, who maintained an expression of neutrality in all his interactions. He's meeting with his attorney at 7:30 and wants time to review papers before the man arrives." Thomas descended the 3 steps but stopped there, maintaining the spatial hierarchy that governed even interactions between enslaved people in the household. He specifically requested the ham from yesterday, not fresh eggs. Said his stomach's been delicate since Tuesday. Celia acknowledged with a slight nod, already revising her mental schedule. The ham sat in the cold room wrapped in cheesecloth, already sliced from the previous evening's service. She would need to warm it with butter and herbs rather than the eggs she had been preparing to scramble. The colonel's digestive complaints had become more frequent over the past year, arriving in irregular waves that seemed to correspond with no particular dietary pattern. Dr. Garrett had visited twice in recent months to examine him, prescribing various tonics that sat in brown glass bottles on the sideboard in the dining room. The medical visits had required Celia to prepare specific bland meals, boiled chicken, plain rice, weak broths, that the colonel had accepted without his usual criticism of underseasoning. Thomas remained on the stairs, The attorneys bringing documents related to his brother's estate in South Carolina. Colonel said if anyone asks, we're to say he's indisposed and not receiving visitors beyond the attorney. There was something in Thomas's stillness that suggested this instruction carried more weight than a simple scheduling preference. The colonel's brother had died 8 months earlier, and there had been ongoing legal complications regarding property distribution that occasionally surfaced in fragments of conversation Celia overheard when serving meals. She returned to the preparation table and began arranging the ham on a silver serving dish that was reserved for the colonel's private meals. "You hear me about the timing?" Thomas asked, though she had clearly acknowledged him. 20 minutes, not 30. He was specific. "I heard," Celia said, not looking up from her work. Thomas climbed back up the stairs, his footsteps fading into the house's upper regions. Celia, in the silence that followed, her movements efficient and unremarkable. She added a small amount of butter to a pan and set it over the fire's lower heat, then retrieved fresh bread from the morning's baking and sliced it thin. The routine was so familiar that her hands completed tasks while her mind tracked separate calculations. The timing of the attorney's visit, the colonel's digestive complaints, the unusual instruction about refusing other visitors, the reference to South Carolina property. None of these details required her response or speculation, but in a household where information moved through informal channels, and enslaved workers survived partly by anticipating their owners' needs before those came demands, noting such patterns was simply practical awareness. She arranged the warmed ham alongside the bread, added a small portion of preserves, and placed everything on a wooden tray with the colonel's preferred coffee service. The clock on the kitchen wall showed 18 minutes had passed since Thomas delivered the instruction. She climbed the stairs from the kitchen to the main floor, moving with the particular quietness that domestic workers develop through years of entering rooms where their presence was required, but their visibility was meant to be minimal. The colonel's study door stood half open. Celia knocked twice with her knuckle against the doorframe, a sound barely louder than the settling of the house itself. The colonel said, his varying the rough edge it held in early morning before he had fully woken. She entered and set the tray on his desk, positioning it to his left side as he preferred, within easy reach, but not interfering with the papers spread across the desk surface. Colonel Thornhill was 53 years old, a man of medium height who had developed a slight stoop in recent years, and whose face had taken on a grayish tint that Dr. Garrett had attributed to insufficient exercise and too much rich food. "That took longer than 20 minutes, he said, not looking at her, his attention fixed on a document he was reading. Celia stood with her hands clasped in front of her apron. "I was told 20 minutes ago, sir. It's been 18. The colonel glanced at his pocket watch, then made a dismissive gesture with one hand. "Fine, leave it." She turned to go. "And Celia," he added, causing her to pause, "the Dormix has been unreliable lately. Keep the meals simple this week. Nothing with heavy sauces or excessive spicing." His tone carried no particular emotion, merely stating a practical requirement. "Dr. Garrett thinks it might be related to stress from the estate settlement." "Yes, sir," and left the study, pulling the door closed to its previous half-open position. She descended back to the kitchen where the morning's remaining tasks waited, preparing the day's other meals, managing the bread rising for evening service, receiving the delivery from the butcher that was scheduled for mid-morning. The interaction with the colonel had lasted less than 2 minutes and contained nothing unusual. Yet something in his mention of the estate settlement and his brother's property in South Carolina had joined with Thomas's earlier instruction about refusing visitors to create vague atmospheric pressure she couldn't identify. She returned to washing the breakfast dishes, the water now grown cold, and let hands complete their work while that unidentified pressure remained, unexplained and unresolved. somewhere in the back of her awareness. The attorney, Mr. Pelham, arrived precisely at 7:30 and remained closeted with Colonel Thornhill for nearly 3 hours. Celia knew this because she was summoned twice to bring fresh coffee, and both times she observed the two men bent over documents that covered the entire desk surface, their voices low and focused. On her second visit, she caught a fragment of conversation as she approached the study door. The will explicitly names her and 2 children, which complicates considerably, especially in Virginia's laws regarding. The colonel's response was quiet to distinguish, but Mr. Pelham's was sharp. Your brother's arrangements in Charleston operated under different statutes, Richard. What was permissible there creates substantial problems here. Celia knocked, entered with the coffee service, and withdrew without either man acknowledging her presence beyond the colonel's brief gesture indicating where to place the tray. The atmosphere in the house shifted after Mr. Pelham's departure. Colonel Thornhill emerged from his study at noon and informed Thomas that he be dining alone in the small parlor rather than the formal dining room, and that he wanted no interruptions for the remainder of the day. This was unusual but not unprecedented. The colonel occasionally retreated into solitary work, when with business matters that required extended concentration. What was more notable was his instruction that Celia should prepare a light supper for early evening, around 6 o'clock, as he expected to immediately afterward. The household's rhythm adjusted accordingly. Thomas managed the colonel's isolation, turning away 2 visitors who arrived unannounced in the afternoon, while Celia worked through her kitchen duties with the particular attentiveness required when the colonel was in a withdrawn mood that could tip toward irritation if any household detail failed to meet his standards. That evening, as Celia prepared the requested light-up poached fish, boiled potatoes, steamed greens, she became aware of Thomas standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her work. This was not his usual pattern. Thomas typically descended to the kitchen only when delivering specific instructions or collecting items to bring upstairs. His presence without stated purpose created a small disruption in the kitchen's normal flow. "Something you need?" Celia asked, not pausing in her preparation of the fish. Thomas stepped fully into the kitchen and closed the door at the top of the stairs behind him, which was even more unusual. The kitchen door was generally left open to allow heat to rise into the house during cold months and to maintain the circulation of air during summer. Closing it created a sense of deliberate privacy. "The colonel got papers today about his brother's property," Thomas said, his voice low despite the closed door. "Papers about people his brother owned in South Carolina. There's a woman there, and her children, that the brother had special arrangements for." Celia set down her knife and turned to face Thomas directly. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the colonel's more often since the brother died, and because he's meeting with attorneys about property division, and because when Pelham left today, he told the colonel that he needed to regularize certain domestic situations before the estate settlement could proceed without complications." Thomas's face remained. His decision to relay this information represented a calculation about risk and alliance. "I heard him say it when I was attending them in the study. The colonel looked at me when Mr. Pelham said it, then told me to leave the room, which he's never done before during business meetings." The implications assembled themselves in Celia's mind with cold clarity. The colonel's brother had maintained an enslaved woman, children in an arrangement that involved legal complications. The estate settlement required the colonel to address similar complications in his own household before property could be properly divided. The attorney had referenced domestic situations in plural. The colonel had looked at Thomas when this was mentioned, then dismissed him, suggesting the conversation that followed concerned matters the colonel didn't want his personal valet to overhear. Celia's position in the household was unlike that of field workers, or even most domestic enslaved people. She'd been purchased 17 years ago specifically to work as cook, had no children, maintained no family connections within the local enslaved community, and lived in isolated proximity to the colonel's daily routine. If there existed what Mr. Pelham called domestic situations requiring regularization, she could reasonably be assumed to be one of them. "What exactly are you asking me?" Celia said to Thomas. "I'm not asking anything," Thomas replied. "I'm telling you what I heard, so you know what might be coming." He moved to leave, then paused with his hand on the door. "The colonel's been sick on and off for how long now? A year? Maybe more?" The question in the air between them, neither accusation nor speculation, simply stated fact. "Dr. Garrett can't find anything wrong with him, but he keeps having these spells. Stomach trouble, weakness. That gray look in his face." Thomas opened the door and climbed back up the stairs, leaving Celia alone in the kitchen with the half-prepared fish and the cold recognition that someone else in the household had noticed the pattern she had been creating so carefully over months of deliberate, incremental action. She returned to preparing the colonel's supper, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind worked through the new variables Thomas's information had introduced. The estate settlement addressing domestic situations before it could proceed. The colonel had been viewing documents related to his brother's arrangements with an enslaved woman and children in South Carolina. Mr. Pelham had used plural when referring to situations requiring regularization. The colonel had specifically dismissed Thomas before continuing that conversation. These facts assembled themselves into probable scenarios, none of which were favorable to Celia's continued position in the household. If the colonel needed to simplify his domestic arrangements before the estate settlement, the most straightforward solution would be to sell her, eliminating any potential complication about her status or the informal authority she had accumulated through years of managing his household. The fish was ready. She arranged it on the colonel's preferred plate with the potatoes and greens, added a small amount of butter and herbs, and placed everything on a tray. She had been adding small amounts of white oleander root to the colonel's food for 14 months, carefully harvested from the decorative bushes that grew along the eastern property line, and prepared through a process of grinding that rendered into a fine powder nearly impossible to detect in prepared dishes. The amounts were minimal, never enough to cause dramatic symptoms, calibrated to produce exactly the kind of vague digestive distress and general weakness that could be attributed to stress, age, or poor constitution. She had learned about oleander from her mother, who had learned it from her mother. Knowledge passed through generations of enslaved women who understood that the same plants white families cultivated for beauty could serve entirely different purposes when properly prepared. She stood looking at the prepared tray, calculating. The estate settlement was moving forward. The colonel needed to resolve complications in his domestic arrangements. Thomas had observed the pattern of illness and had chosen to warn her, rather than report his suspicions, which meant he had made his own calculation about where his interests lay. If the colonel planned to sell her as part of simplifying his household, the poisoning would need to stop immediately to avoid drawing attention to the correlation between her presence and his symptoms. But if she stopped now, he would recover, complete the estate settlement, sell her, and she would face an unknown future with a new owner who might be considerably worse than the colonel's combination of distant oversight and casual cruelty. The alternative was to continue, perhaps even to accelerate, accepting that the risk of detection had now increased with Thomas's awareness, but betting that his own precarious position in the household would keep him silent. She picked up the tray and carried it upstairs to the small parlor where the colonel waited. He was seated in his preferred chair, with documents spread across the side table, still working through papers related to the estate. She set the tray on the table within his reach and stepped back. "Dr. Garrett's tonic is on the sideboard if you need it, sir," she said, her voice carrying neutral tone it always did. The colonel glanced at the food, his expression unreadable. "This is fine. You can go." She left the parlor and returned to the kitchen, where the evening's remaining work waited. She had made no decision yet about whether to continue or stop the poisoning, but the presence of the unmade decision sat in her chest like a physical weight, demanding resolution. 3 days later, Colonel Thornhill called Celia to his study mid-morning, which was unusual as he typically communicated household instructions through Thomas. She climbed the stairs and found him seated at his desk with a single sheet of paper before him, his hands folded on the desk's surface. "Close the door," he said. She did. "I've been reviewing my household arrangements in light of some legal matters that need resolution." His tone was businesslike, neither warm nor hostile. "My attorney has advised me that certain aspects of my domestic situation require formal documentation to avoid complications during the estate settlement process." He picked paper and turned it so she could see it, though she couldn't read the legal text printed there. "This is a manumission document. It grants you freedom, effective in 1 year's time, provided you continue your current duties satisfactorily during that period." He set the paper back down. "The delay is necessary to demonstrate that this is a considered decision, not an impulsive act that could be challenged by my heirs. After 1 year, you'll be issued free papers and released from service. In the meantime, your position here remains exactly as it is. Do you understand?" Celia stood absolutely still, processing information that contradicted every assumption she had built over the previous 3 days. "Yes, sir," she said, because no other response was possible. "My attorney suggested this arrangement to avoid potential claims against the estate regarding—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your status and the authority you've accumulated in managing household operations. A clean legal resolution is preferable to ambiguity." He returned the document to a folder on his desk. "You're dismissed." She left the study and descended to the kitchen, her mind completely blank. The colonel had just promised her freedom in 1 year. The poisoning she had been conducting for 14 months had been predicated on the assumption that she would remain enslaved indefinitely, that the only possible escape from the colonel's ownership was his death. The legal framework that had seemed absolute and unchangeable had just revealed itself to be negotiable, subject to modification through paperwork and attorney advice. Every calculation she had made about risk, morality, and survival had been based on a reality that had apparently never been as fixed as she had believed. She stood in the kitchen, her hands resting on the preparation table, unable to begin the day's work. The oleander powder sat in a small ceramic container in the back of the larder, hidden behind jars of preserved fruit. She had been adding it to the colonel's meals on 3 times per week, varying the timing and amount to avoid establishing a detectable pattern. His symptoms had been worsening gradually, the digestive problems and weakness becoming more frequent and more severe. Dr. Garrett had begun suggesting the possibility of some chronic condition that would require long-term medical management. The trajectory had been clear. Within another 6 to 8 months, the colonel would likely be seriously ill, and within a year to 18 months, the accumulated poison would probably kill him. She had accepted this timeline because it had seemed the only path to ending her enslavement. Now there was a different path, a legal one that required continuing her current duties satisfactorily and accepting freedom as a granted rather than something achieved through sustained violence against her owner. The moral equation had shifted completely. When the colonel's death had been the only route to freedom, the poisoning had carried a desperate logic. Now it was simply murder, premeditated and unnecessary, committed against a man who had just promised to free her. She opened the larder and retrieved the ceramic container. The oleander powder looked harmless, like any other kitchen ingredient. She had been so careful in its preparation and administration, treating it as both tool and secret, the physical manifestation of her resistance against the system that had defined her entire adult life. She could pour it out now, dispose of it, stop the poisoning, and wait the promised year. The colonel would recover, the estate settlement would completed, and she would be freed according to the legal document now sitting in his study. But the document wouldn't be official for a year. The colonel could change his mind at any point during that time. The estate settlement could produce unexpected complications that made her manumission inconvenient. He could die of natural causes before the year elapsed, and his heirs could contest the document. The promise of freedom was not freedom itself, and she had lived under slavery long enough that white people's promises held no binding force beyond their current utility. The poisoning represented certainty, or as close to certainty as anything in her position could achieve. If the colonel died, she might be suspected, but without proof she would likely be sold to settle his estate, and a new owner in a different location would mean escape from anyone who knew her history. The promise of future freedom was exactly that, a promise contingent on dozens of variables beyond her control. She put the ceramic container back in its hiding place and closed the larder door. She had made no decision about whether to trust the colonel's promise or continue toward his death. But the framework of that decision had changed entirely, and she needed time to think through implications that reached far beyond the simple calculation of adding or not adding poison to his next meal. The following month preceded it in a state of suspended uncertainty. Celia continued preparing the colonel's meals without adding oleander, choosing delay rather than either commitment to trust or commitment to killing. The colonel's health stabilized, then began to improve. The gray tint faded from his complexion. The digestive complaints became less frequent. Dr. Garrett visited, examined him, and declared that whatever had been troubling the colonel appeared to be resolving on its own, perhaps indicating that it had been stress-related after all, just as they had suspected. The colonel received this news with visible relief and immediately became more active in managing his affairs, hosting meetings with business associates, traveling twice to Richmond for matters related to the estate settlement, and resuming social obligations he had been avoiding during his period of illness. Thomas observed this recovery with the same careful neutrality he brought to everything, but his awareness of Celia's role created a thread of tension in their interactions. He never directly addressed the subject again, but occasionally his glance would linger in the kitchen, a silent acknowledgement of their shared knowledge. Celia understood that Thomas's silence represented his own calculation about survival. He had warned her because he believed his interests were better served by her continued presence in the household than by whatever disruption her sudden departure would cause. As long as she remained valuable to the household's operation and represented no threat to Thomas's position, his silence would likely continue. But these were assumptions built on interpretation of behavior, not explicit agreements, and the foundation remained fundamentally unstable. In early May, 6 weeks after the colonel had shown her the manumission document, he summoned her again to his study. This time Mr. Pelham was present, seated in one of the study's chairs with a leather portfolio open on his lap. "Celia," the colonel began, "Mr. Pelham has been advising me on the proper execution of the manumission document I showed you previously. There are specific procedures required to ensure the document will be legally binding and not subject to challenge." He gestured to Mr. Pelham, who withdrew a different sheet of paper from his portfolio. "The document requires witness signatures from 2 white citizens of standing in the community," Mr. Pelham explained, his tone suggesting he was describing a minor requirement rather than something that would determine whether Celia lived the rest of her life enslaved or free. Additionally, the county clerk must record the manumission in the official register, and you must be examined by a county official to verify that you understand and consent to the arrangement. He set the paper on the colonel's desk. This process typically takes between 2 and 4 months to complete, assuming no objections are filed by interested parties. What interested parties? Celia asked, the question emerging before she could consider whether speaking was appropriate. Mr. Pallium's eyebrows rose slightly at her direct question, but he answered. The colonel's heirs, primarily. If they believe the manumission reduces the estate's value in ways that if their inheritance, they could file an objection. Additionally, creditors could object if they believe you represent collateral against outstanding debts. He glanced at the colonel. However, Colonel Thornhill's estate is well ordered, and I anticipate no such complications. The colonel nodded. I've discussed this with my son, who will inherit the property. He has no objection to your manumission, particularly as you'll be used to him, that he plans to sell this property and relocate to Baltimore. This was new information. Celia had known the colonel's son, who lived in Richmond and rarely visited, but she hadn't known he intended to sell the plantation. So the timeline remains as I indicated. 1 year from the date of the original document, which was April 8th, meaning your freedom will be effective April 8th next year, provided the paperwork is properly executed and no complications arise. Yes, sir, Celia said, because again no other response was possible. The colonel dismissed her, and she returned to the kitchen where the afternoon's work waited. She had been given more information, but no more certainty. The manumission was moving forward through proper legal channels, which suggested the colonel was serious about executing it, but it also revealed new potential obstacles. Witnesses, county examination, heir approval, credit review, and an extended timeline that be disrupted by the colonel's death or any number of other contingencies. The question of whether to trust the process or return to poisoning remained unresolved. But the colonel's improved health meant that if she chose to resume, she would be doing so with clear awareness that she was killing a man who had taken concrete legal steps toward freeing her. The decision would have remained theoretical, except that in late May, the colonel's health began to decline again. Not from poison. Celia had added nothing to his food since learning about the manumission document, but from what Dr. Garrett eventually diagnosed as pneumonia following a week of heavy rain during which the colonel had insisted on traveling to Richmond despite developing a persistent cough. The illness progressed rapidly. Within 10 days, the colonel was confined to bed, running a high fever, struggling to breathe. Dr. Garrett visited daily, applying various treatments that seemed to have no effect. The household shifted into crisis mode, with Thomas managing constant visitors who came to inquire about the colonel's condition, and Celia preparing the broths and weak teas that were all the colonel consumed. On the 6th day of the colonel's confinement to bed, his son arrived from Richmond, a man named Edmund who was 32 years old and whom Celia had only met briefly during his infrequent visits to the plantation. Edmund brought with him an air of impatient authority, immediately taking control of the sick room and dismissing Dr. Garrett's treatments as ineffective. He installed a different physician, Dr. Munrund, who examined the colonel and declared that more aggressive intervention was needed. The new treatments involved bloodletting and stronger medicines that left the colonel even weaker than before. During this period, Edmund twice called Celia to the colonel's bed to ask specific questions about his father's diet and health history. My father mentioned he's been experiencing digestive problems for over a year, Edmund said during the first of these interviews, his tone carrying an edge of suspicion. What exactly has he been eating during this time? Celia described the colonel's meals in careful detail, noting the bland Dr. Garrett had prescribed during his digestive episodes, the avoidance of rich sauces and heavy spicing, the frequent light suppers. Edmund listened without expression, then asked, and his symptoms would improve and worsen with no apparent pattern. She confirmed this. Dr. Monroe says that's unusual for a digestive ailment. He suggests it might indicate some kind of intermittent poisoning, possibly from contaminated water or spoiled food stored improperly. Edmund's gaze fixed on her with unmistakable accusation. Have there been any changes in food storage or preparation that might explain such contamination? No, sir. Meeting his eyes directly because looking away would suggest guilt. I've prepared the colonel's meals the same way for 17 years. The larder is kept clean. The water comes from the same well it always has. Nothing's changed. Edmund dismissed her, but the accusation hung in the air. He had not directly charged her with deliberate poisoning, but he had introduced the concept, and in doing so had revealed that he was considering possibilities beyond natural illness. This was complicated by the fact that the colonel's current pneumonia was entirely natural, unrelated to the earlier poisoning Celia had committed. But Edmund didn't know that, and the historical pattern of digestive illness, followed by periods of improvement, created a suspicious background that could easily be reinterpreted as evidence of intentional harm. 2 days later, Edmund appeared in the kitchen while Celia was preparing the evening broth. I've been reviewing my father's papers, he said without preamble. I found the manumission document he had prepared for you. His tone was flat, impossible to read. Do you know why he decided to do this? He said it was related to the estate settlement, Celia replied, continuing to work on the broth, because stopping would suggest the conversation made her nervous. Mr. Pelham advised him to regularize domestic situations. Regularize, Edmund repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. My father made a lot of irregular decisions in his later years. This is among them. He moved closer, standing directly in her line of sight, so she had to acknowledge him fully. The document isn't valid yet. It requires completion of certain legal procedures, and more importantly, it requires my father to survive until those procedures are finished. If he dies before the manumission is officially recorded, the document becomes void, and you remain property of the estate, to be sold along with everything else. The threat was explicit. Edmund was telling her that the colonel's death would eliminate her path to freedom and return her to the status of property to be liquidated. But beneath that threat was an implication that went further. If the colonel died under circumstances that suggested foul play, and if Edmund chose to pursue an investigation, Celia would face not just continued enslavement but possible execution for murder. The strategic situation had shifted completely. The colonel's death, which had once been her only route to freedom, was now the primary obstacle to achieving it. But Edmund's hostile attitude and his clear displeasure with the manumission arrangement suggested that even if the colonel survived and completed legal procedures, Edmund might find ways to challenge or delay the process. I understand, sir, Celia said, which was the only safe response. Edmund left the kitchen, and Celia stood holding the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the broth, her mind working through scenarios that all seemed to lead to variations of the same trapped outcome. If the colonel died, her freedom died with him. If the colonel survived but Edmund remained hostile, he could complicate the manumission process indefinitely. The only path to actual freedom required the colonel to survive long enough to complete the legal procedures, and to do so while maintaining his commitment to freeing her despite his son's obvious opposition. This was a profoundly uncertain foundation on which to stake everything, but it was the only option available. That night, working in the kitchen after the rest of the household had retired, Celia retrieved the ceramic container from its hiding place in the larder and carried it outside to the kitchen garden. She dug a small hole near the fence line and buried the oleander powder, covering it carefully and marking the location in her memory, in case she ever needed to retrieve it. The gesture felt both necessary and absurd. She was literally burying the weapon she had been using against the colonel, committing herself to his survival, betting everything on his promise of freedom and his ability to execute that promise despite hostility and despite the dozens of complications that could arise over the remaining months before the manumission became official. She returned to the kitchen and washed her hands thoroughly, scrubbing them long past the point of cleanliness, trying to remove the sense of having surrendered the only power she had ever possessed. The colonel lay upstairs, dying of pneumonia, a natural illness that would kill him, or not entirely independent of her actions. Edmund waited like a predator for any excuse to invalidate the manumission and reclaim her as estate property. Thomas maintained his careful silence, aware of too much and committed to nothing. And she stood in the kitchen at midnight, her hands raw from washing, having chosen to trust a legal system designed to keep her enslaved and a white man's promise that could evaporate at his convenience or his death. The decision was made, but its correctness remained unknown and unknowable until events resolved themselves one way or another. She dried her hands and began preparing the morning's bread dough, returning to the work that had filled her days for 17 years and would continue to fill them until freedom arrived or failed to arrive, the outcome entirely beyond her control. The colonel's pneumonia reached crisis on a Thursday night in early June. Dr. Monroe declared that the next 48 hours would determine whether the colonel's constitution was strong enough to overcome the infection or whether it would overwhelm him entirely. Edmund took up permanent residence in the sick room, leaving only for brief intervals to eat or consult with Dr. Monroe. The household entered a state of hushed emergency, with servants moving through their duties in near silence and visitors arriving to pay what might be final respects to a man who had been a significant figure in the county's planting community for 3 decades. Celia prepared foods the colonel couldn't eat. He was beyond consuming anything but water and occasionalfuls of broth, because the household still needed to function and Edmund still needed to be fed. She worked in the kitchen alone, as Thomas was occupied managing the constant flows and messages. The isolation suited her. She had nothing to contribute to the colonel's care beyond the broths that Dr. Monroe occasionally requested, and presence in other parts of the house would only draw attention to her ambiguous status as enslaved woman who might become free woman if the man upstairs survived long enough to complete paperwork. On Friday evening, Edmund appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face showed the exhaustion of 2 days without proper sleep, his clothes were rumpled, and his manner carried none of its usual hostile precision. "My father is asking for you," he said, the words clearly costing him something to deliver. "Dr. Monroe says we should accommodate his requests, given his condition." Celia followed Edmund upstairs to the sick room, where the colonel lay propped on pillows, his breathing labored and shallow. Dr. Monroe stood to one side, monitoring the patient with professional detachment. The room smelled of illness and the various medicines that had been administered. Edmund gestured for Celia to approach the bedside, then positioned himself near the door, watching. "Celia," the colonel said, his voice barely above a whisper. She moved closer. "I want you to know that the manumission papers are in order. Mr. Pelham has assured me that even if I don't survive this illness, the documents are sufficiently advanced in the legal process that they'll be honored." He paused to catch his breath, the effort clearly painful. "Edmund's been instructed to see the process through to completion. It's my wish and he'll respect it." From his position by the door, Edmund's expression suggested this was news to him, or at least news that he was being informed of it in front of witnesses. The colonel had effectively bound his son to honoring the manumission by stating it as direct wish in the presence of Dr. Monroe, whose testimony would carry weight if Edmund later tried to claim ignorance or misunderstanding. "Thank you, sir," Celia said, because gratitude seemed to be the expected response, though the emotion behind the words was far more complicated than simple thanks. "I know you've served this household faithfully for many years. The colonel continued, each word requiring visible effort. It's appropriate that service should be recognized with freedom. That's how it should work. His breathing became more labored, and Dr. Munro forward to adjust the pillows. The colonel waved him back. I want this done properly, regardless of what happens to me. Edmund, you understand? Yes, father, Edmund said, his voice tight with barely suppressed anger. The colonel's eyes closed, and Dr. Munro gestured that the interview was over. Celia left the sick room and returned to the kitchen, where she sat at the preparation table trying to process what had just occurred. The colonel had publicly committed Edmund to honoring the manumission, using his potential death as leverage to force son's compliance. It was a calculated move that suggested the colonel understood exactly how Edmund would behave once his father was no longer alive to enforce his wishes. By making the commitment explicit in front of Dr. Munro, the colonel had created a social obligation that would be difficult for Edmund to violate without damaging his reputation. But social obligations were not legal requirements. Edmund's hostility toward the manumission had been clear throughout this crisis. Even if they survived and completed the legal process himself, Edmund's opposition would remain a factor. And if the colonel died, Edmund would inherit the estate and all the power that came with it, including the power to delay, complicate, or undermine the manumission process through various legal and bureaucratic mechanisms. The colonel survived the crisis. By Saturday evening his fever had broken, and by Sunday morning he was conscious and coherent, though profoundly weak. Dr. Munro declared the immediate danger past, though he warned that full recovery would take weeks, and that the colonel's constitution had been severely compromised by the illness. Edmund remained in residence, ostensibly to oversee his father's care, but functionally to begin asserting control over the plantation's operations. He held meetings with the property's overseer, reviewed the account books, and began making decisions about planting and harvest schedules that had previously been the colonel's exclusive domain. 3 weeks after the crisis passed, with the colonel still confined to bed but steadily improving, Edmund summoned Celia to the study that he had appropriated as his temporary office. My father, cover, he said without preamble. But he won't be capable of managing this property anymore. I'll be taking over operations immediately, and will eventually complete the sale once he's well enough to sign the necessary documents. He shuffled papers on the desk in a gesture of false busyness. This means the household arrangements will change. I don't need a full-time cook for a household that will soon cease to exist. Once my father is well enough to travel, he'll relocate to Richmond to live with me, and this property will be prepared for sale. And the manumission? Celia asked directly, abandoning any pretense of deference. We'll proceed according to the legal requirements, Edmund said, meeting her directness with his own. My father made his wishes clear, and I'll honor them as instructed. But the timeline may be affected by the change in household arrangements. You'll need to wait until all the paperwork is properly executed, which could take longer now given the complications. His smile held no warmth. I suggest you continue performing your current duties satisfactorily while these matters are resolved. Any failure to do so would give me grounds to contest the manumission as inappropriate reward for inadequate service. The threat was clear. Edmund would technically honor his father's commitment, but would make the process as slow and conditional as possible, creating opportunities for Celia to fail the undefined standard of satisfactory service that would justify canceling the entire arrangement. It was a trap with no obvious escape. If she protested or resisted, he would use that as evidence of unsatisfactory service. If she accepted his terms, she would be subjected to months of deliberately impossible standards designed to produce failure. I understand, said, though understanding and accepting were different things. You're dismissed, Edmund said, already returning his attention to the papers on the desk. Celia's study and walked through the house to the kitchen, her mind entirely empty of coherent thought. She had survived the colonel's illness only to find herself facing Edmund's systematic dismantling of any path to freedom. The colonel had promised manumission, had taken legal steps to execute it, had even publicly bound Edmund to honoring it. But none of that mattered when Edmund controlled the practical mechanisms of implementation. He could delay the process indefinitely, bureaucratic requirements. He could create impossible standards of service that she would inevitably fail. He could contest the manumission based on technicalities that Mr. Pelham might or might not be able to counter. The entire framework that had seemed to offer a legitimate path to freedom was revealing itself to be as contingent and manipulable as everything else in the system designed to maintain slavery. That night, she returned to the kitchen garden and dug up the buried ceramic container. The oleander powder had survived its burial intact, still dry and potent. She carried it back inside and placed it in its original hiding spot in the larder. She made no immediate decision about using it, but its availability represented a form of agency that Edmund's threats had reminded her might be the only real power available to someone in her position. The choice between trusting the legal process and returning to poison remained unmade, but the option needed to stay open, because the alternative was accepting Edmund's version of freedom, which was simply another form of control designed to keep her trapped indefinitely. The colonel signed the final manumission papers on March 13, 1856, nearly 11 months after the original document had been prepared. The delay had been caused by Edmund's systematic complications. Questions about proper witness signatures, requests for additional county review, concerns about the estate's creditor obligations, arguments about timing of the document's effectiveness. Mr. Pelham had navigated each obstacle with professional competence. But the process had stretched across months of uncertainty during which Celia continued working in the household, while Edmund maintained his barely concealed hostility. The colonel himself had been largely absent from these negotiations. His recovery from pneumonia had been slow and incomplete, leaving him weakened and largely confined to the main house. He had relocated to Richmond as Edmund had planned, leaving the plantation under Edmund's management while the property was prepared for sale. Celia had remained at the plantation throughout this period, her status suspended between and free, subject to Edmund's authority, but theoretically protected by the pending manumission. On March 14th, one day after signing the papers, the colonel died in his sleep at Edmund's house in Richmond. Dr. Monroe, who had continued as the colonel's physician, recorded the cause as heart failure, noting that the patient's constitution had never fully recovered from the pneumonia, and that stress in managing the estate settlement had likely contributed to cardiac collapse. The death was unexpected only in its timing. Dr. Monroe had been predicting gradual decline, not sudden death, but acknowledged that cardiac events could occur without warning in patients with compromised health. Celia received news of the colonel's death via messenger, a brief note from Edmund stating that the colonel had passed and that all household staff should continue their current duties until further notice. The note made no mention of the manumission papers or their legal status. Now that the colonel was dead, Celia worked through the day in a state of suspended awareness, preparing meals that felt pointless given that the household was in the process of being dissolved, waiting for additional information that didn't arrive. 3 days later, Mr. Pelham appeared at the plantation with a leather folder containing official documents. He met with Celia in the now unused study that had belonged to the colonel. The manumission papers were fully executed and recorded with the county clerk before the colonel's death, Mr. Pelham said, arranging documents on the desk. This means they remain legally valid. However, Edmund has indicated he plans to contest their validity based on claims that his father was not of sound mind when he signed them, given his weakened condition. Pelham's expression suggested professional disapproval of this strategy. I've advised Edmund that such a contest would likely fail, as multiple witnesses, including myself and Dr. Monroe, can testify that the colonel was entirely lucid and intentional when signing. But Edmund seems determined to pursue it regardless. Can he succeed? Celia asked. Unlikely, but not impossible, Pelham replied. The legal process for contesting a manumission is complex and would take months to resolve. During that time, your status would remain ambiguous. You would not be formally enslaved, as the manumission papers exist and are recorded, but you also would entirely free, as they would be under legal challenge. He retrieved a specific document from the folder. However, I would strongly advise you to leave Virginia as soon as possible. Even if Edmund's contest fails, he could pursue other legal mechanisms to restrict your freedom, such as claiming you owe debts to the estate or accusing you of theft of property. Once you're in a free state, such claims become much more difficult to enforce. Where should I go? Celia asked, the question feeling both practical and absurd. Pennsylvania would be safest. Philadelphia has an established free black community and organizations that assist people in your situation, Pelham said. He handed her a small amount of cash from his pocket. This is from the colonel's estate, technically payment for your final month of service. Use it for travel. He stood to leave. I'll file the necessary counter-arguments to Edmund's contest, but I can't guarantee how long the process will take or what the outcome will be. Your best option is to leave before Edmund can implement additional restrictions. Pelham departed, and Celia sat holding the cash and the document declaring her freedom, both feeling equally insubstantial. The legal system had granted her freedom through properly executed paperwork. That the same legal system now offered Edmund mechanisms to challenge or undermine that freedom indefinitely. The colonel's death had removed the one person who had been genuinely committed to seeing the manumission through, leaving her dependent on Mr. Pelham's professional ethics and the uncertain outcomes of legal processes designed by people who had no interest in her actual liberty. She left the plantation 2 days later, carrying only what she could fit in a single bag. Thomas saw her leaving and offered no comment beyond a brief nod of acknowledgement. The other enslaved workers on the plantation knew something had changed in her status, but understood that asking questions would only create complications for everyone. She walked to the main road and caught a wagon heading toward Richmond, paying the driver with some of Pelham's cash. From Richmond she would find transport north, toward Pennsylvania, and whatever existence awaited her there. The county records for Fairfax County, Virginia, show the manumission document recorded on March 13, 1856, signed by Colonel Richard Thornhill and witnessed by Miss Henry Pelham and Dr. Samuel Monroe. A separate filing 3 weeks later shows Ed Thornhill's formal contest the manumission, claiming diminished mental capacity of the deceased. No resolution of this contest appears in the county records. No death certificate exists for anyone named Celia matching the approximate age and description. No subsequent legal documents reference the case. The Thornhill plantation was sold in September 1856 to a family from Baltimore, the sale documents making no mention of disputed property or unresolved claims. Edmund Thornhill died in 1873 in Richmond, his estate papers listing no outstanding legal matters. The manumission document remains in the county archive, neither validated nor invalidated. A piece of paper asserting freedom that may or may not have ever been realized by the woman it named.